You choose to admit your crimes before man and God.
You know the signs.
You are bewitched.
Channel me a spirit.
Hear me when I say he's evil. Evil absolute.
There are certain films that arrive quietly, without the fanfare of blockbuster marketing campaigns or the weight of massive studio expectations, and yet manage to carve out a permanent space in the memory of every viewer who stumbles upon them. Warlock, released in 1989 and directed by Steve Miner, is precisely that kind of film. It is a movie that blends horror, dark fantasy, and time travel adventure into something genuinely unique, a story rooted in the terrifying mythology of witchcraft and demonology, but told with enough wit, energy, and cinematic flair to keep audiences thoroughly entertained from its atmospheric opening, frames all the way through to its fiery, satisfying climax. And at the heart of it all is one of the most magnetic and underappreciated villain performances of the entire decade, delivered by the late, great Julian Sands in a role that should have made him a household name in genre cinema forever. To truly appreciate what Warlock accomplishes, you have to understand the creative landscape it was born into. The late 1980s were an extraordinarily fertile period for horror and dark fantasy filmmaking. Studios and independent production companies alike were churning out supernatural thrillers at a remarkable pace, and audiences had developed a genuine appetite for films that pushed beyond the slasher template and explored darker, more mythologically rich territory. It was the era of Hellraiser, the Lost Boys near-dark and Pumpkinhead films that took their monsters seriously and wrapped them in genuine menace. Warlock fits perfectly into this tradition, but distinguishes itself through a premise that is both brilliantly simple and endlessly inventive. Take a genuinely evil supernatural villain from the 17th century, drop him into the bright, neon-soaked world of modern Los Angeles, and watch chaos unfold. The contrast between the ancient and the contemporary is not merely a gimmick here. It is the engine that drives the entire narrative and gives the film much of its dark, sardonic energy. The story begins in the year 1691, in the colony of Massachusetts, during one of the most notorious chapters in American history, the era of the witch trials. The atmosphere established in these opening scenes is extraordinary. Director Steve Miner, who had already demonstrated a strong command of horror filmmaking through his work on Friday the 13th Part 2 and Friday the 13th Part III, shows considerable restraint and craft here, building a world of flickering torchlight, timber-framed buildings, and creaking gallows that feels genuinely authentic. Into this world, we are introduced to two central figures whose fates are bound together across centuries. The first is Giles Redfern, played with fierce intensity and unwavering conviction by Richard E.Grant, a professional witch hunter who has dedicated his life to hunting down practitioners of the dark arts. Redfern is not a cartoon zealot. He is a man of deep and sincere belief, operating within a historical context where the threat of supernatural evil is considered as real and as present as the threat of fire or disease. Grant brings tremendous intelligence and physicality to the role, and his portrayal of Redfern as a man simultaneously out of his depth and utterly unshakable in his purpose becomes one of the great anchors of the entire film. The second figure is the Warlock himself, and this is where Julian Sands enters the picture and immediately announces himself as something extraordinary. In the opening scene set in colonial Massachusetts, the Warlock is presented as a prisoner awaiting execution, but even in chains, even confined and condemned, he radiates a cold, preternatural power that makes every scene he inhabits feel dangerous. He is not the Warlock of fairy tales or pulp fiction. He is something older and more disturbing, a genuine servant of Satan, a man who has willingly surrendered his soul in exchange for abilities that place him far beyond the reach of ordinary human intervention. Sands plays him with an otherworldly grace that is difficult to describe and impossible to forget. He moves through scenes with a kind of predatory elegance, his pale eyes carrying a quality of ancient malevolence that no amount of special effects could manufacture. He is charming in the way that truly dangerous things are charming, in the way that a lit match is charming when held above an open barrel of oil. On the eve of his execution, the Warlock performs a ritual that opens a temporal vortex, and in a sequence that brilliantly merges the visceral with the supernatural, he is hurled forward through time, landing in the 20th century, in the contemporary city of Los Angeles, with all of his powers intact and a very specific, world-ending mission to fulfill. Redfern, refusing to allow his quarry to escape justice, follows him through the vortex, arriving in the modern world disoriented, furious, and utterly bewildered by the civilization he finds himself in. The comedic potential of this situation is not ignored. There are genuinely funny moments in watching Redfern attempt to navigate a world of automobiles, electric lights, and fast food. But the film wisely never lets the humor undermine the genuine threat the Warlock represents. The laughter, when it comes, is always in service of the story rather than at its expense. It is in the modern-day sections of the film that the third major character enters the narrative, and she proves to be every bit as essential as the two men at the center of the conflict. Cassandra, played by Laurie Singer, is a young woman living in a Los Angeles bungalow who has the considerable misfortune of being present when the Warlock crashes through her world in a storm of supernatural energy. Singer was primarily known at this point for her work in the television series Fame and the film Footloose, and Warlock gave her an opportunity to demonstrate a tougher, more sardonic edge than either of those projects had required. Cassandra is not a passive figure waiting to be rescued. She is sharp, resourceful, and possessed of a dry humor that makes her genuinely likable, even when the circumstances around her are descending into nightmare. When the Warlock places a curse upon her that causes her to age 20 years for every day that passes, Singer does something remarkable. She makes the audience feel the genuine horror of what is happening to this woman without ever allowing Cassandra to collapse into helplessness. Her acting is rendered through increasingly impressive practical makeup effects that serve as a constant, ticking reminder of the stakes involved. Every wrinkle that appears on her face is another reminder that the clock is running out. The mission that drives the Warlock through the modern world is one of the film's most inspired creative decisions. He is not simply in Los Angeles to cause random mayhem, he has a purpose. And that purpose is nothing less than the literal destruction of the world. He is searching for the 3 scattered volumes of the Grand Grimoire, an ancient and forbidden text that, when assembled and read aloud in its entirety, will reveal the true name of God. In the film's mythology, knowledge of this name will allow Satan to unmake creation itself, to effectively reverse the act of Genesis and return the universe to the void. It is an apocalyptic objective of magnificent scope, and it gives the Warlock's violence throughout the film a genuinely terrifying context. Every person he kills, every community he passes through, every dark ritual he performs is in service of this ultimate goal. He is not a killer for the pleasure of killing, though he takes no particular discomfort in it. He is a man on a mission, and that singular focus makes him more frightening than any amount of random savagery could. As the Warlock moves from location to location, tracking down the scattered pieces of the grimoire, the film takes on the quality of a dark road movie, with Cassandra and Redfern following in his wake, racing against both the clock of her accelerating agging and the Warlock's terrible objective. The road movie structure serves the film extremely well, allowing the story to visit a variety of locations and introduce a succession of memorable supporting characters who encounter the Warlock with varying degrees of horror and consequence. There is a marvelous scene involving a rural family and a weather vane that manages to be genuinely unsettling, while also demonstrating the Warlock's complete indifference to human life or suffering. There are encounters that showcase his ingenuity and his ruthlessness in equal measure, and each one adds another layer to the portrait Julian Sands is building, a portrait of a being who is not angry, not passionate, not motivated by any human emotion, but simply and terrifyingly purposeful. The relationship that develops between Cassandra and Redfern as they pursue their quarry is one of the film's most satisfying elements. They begin as strangers thrown together by impossible circumstances, and the dynamic between them crackles with a kind of cultural friction that the screenplay mines for both comedy and genuine dramatic resonance. Redfern cannot understand the world he finds himself in, its freedoms, its technologies, its social customs are all completely alien to him, and Cassandra has to serve as his reluctant guide while simultaneously dealing with the supernatural curse that is destroying her from the outside in. Laurie Singer and Richard E.Grant play off each other beautifully, developing a partnership that feels earned rather than imposed, and as the film progresses and the danger escalates, their relationship deepens into something approaching genuine mutual respect and affection. It is the kind of character work that elevates a genre film from mere entertainment to something genuinely memorable. Steve Miner's direction throughout is assured and inventive, particularly in the film's action and supernatural sequences. He has a strong instinct for building and releasing tension, and he uses the contrast between the mundane modernity of his locations and the ancient evil moving through them to consistently unsettling effect. There is something inherently disturbing about watching a 17th century warlock walk through the bright aisles of a supermarket or sit in a contemporary American diner, and Miner understands that the horror of these juxtapositions is at least as powerful as anything that can be achieved through conventional shock tactics. The film's special effects, produced with the practical ingenuity that characterized the best genre filmmaking of the era, hold up remarkably well. The levitation sequences, the moments of dark magic, the agging effects applied to Cassandra, all of them demonstrate a craftsmanship and a commitment to physical, tactile filmmaking that digital effects have not necessarily improved upon. The screenplay, written by David Tuhai, who would later go on to write and direct Pitch Black and its sequels, is a model of efficient, intelligent genre writing. Tuhai understands that the best genre premises are essentially engines for exploring character, and he structures Warlock in a way that keeps the supernatural elements firmly in service of the human story at the center of it all. The Warlock's quest for the Grimoire is compelling because of what it means for Cassandra and Redfern specifically, not just for humanity in the abstract. Tuhai also demonstrates a strong command of his film's internal mythology, establishing rules for the Warlock's abilities that the story then respects and builds upon, including some wonderfully inventive magical countermeasures that Redfern deploys against his quarry, drawn from genuine historical and folkloric traditions around witchcraft and demonology. The salt, the iron, the consecrated earth, these elements are woven into the narrative with the kind of respectful attention to mythological detail that serious genre fans genuinely appreciate. Julian Sands remained one of the most compelling aspects of Warlock throughout his career, and the role of the Warlock represents perhaps his finest genre achievement. Sands was a classically trained British actor whose considerable talents were not always best served by the roles available to him in mainstream cinema, but in Warlock, he found a character that allowed him to operate at full intensity. His Warlock is never campy, never winking at the audience, never playing to the cheap seats. He is always completely committed to the reality of what he is doing, and that commitment is what makes him so genuinely frightening. The scene in which he prepares a particularly horrifying dark ritual, using an ingredient that the film implies but never states explicitly, is one of the most disturbing sequences in the entire genre output of the decade, rendered even more effective by Sands' complete matter-of-factness about the whole business. He does terrible things in this film, and he does them with the placid efficiency of a man performing routine tasks, and somehow that is more horrifying than any amount of theatrical villainy could ever be. The film builds toward a climax that delivers both dramatically and visually, bringing Cassandra, Redfern, and the Warlock into a final confrontation that ties together the threads the story has been carefully laying throughout its running time. Without revealing every detail for those who have not yet had the pleasure of experiencing the film, it can be said that the ending is both satisfying and appropriately spectacular, making full use of the supernatural mythology the screenplay has established, while also honoring the character journeys of its central figures. It is the kind of ending that feels genuinely earned rather than imposed. And it leaves the audience with the particular satisfaction of a story well told and a conflict well resolved. Warlock received a somewhat limited theatrical release and performed modestly at the box office, which is perhaps not surprising given that it was a mid-budget genre film without major stars at the peak of their mainstream commercial appeal. But the film found its true audience on home video in the years that followed, building a devoted and passionate following that has only grown in the decades since. It spawned a sequel, Warlock, The Armageddon, released in 1993, which brought Julian Sands back in a different incarnation of the character. Though it is the original film that most devotees regard as the superior work, for the simple reason that nothing in the sequel quite manages to recapture the specific energy and craftsmanship of what Steve Miner and David Tuhai achieved the first time around. Part of what makes Warlock so enduringly watchable is its tonal confidence. It knows exactly what it is and exactly what it wants to be. It is a dark fantasy adventure film with genuine horror elements, and it pursues that identity with complete conviction, never apologizing for its genre trappings and never condescending to its audience by winking too broadly at its own premise. The time travel element could easily have been played purely for comedy, the witchcraft mythology could have been diluted into something more palatable, the villain could have been softened into a more conventional movie monster, but none of those compromises were made, and the result is a film that has aged far better than many of its more commercially successful contemporaries. There is also something worth noting about the film's relationship to the historical realities it draws upon. The opening sequences set in colonial Massachusetts are not merely a convenient backdrop. They serve as a genuine acknowledgement of the historical terror of the witch trial era, the profound human cost of supernatural belief weaponized by fear and prejudice. By rooting the story in that specific historical moment before flinging it into the contemporary world, the film creates a thematic resonance that lingers beneath its genre pleasures. The Warlock is, in a sense, a product of that era, a genuine manifestation of the evil that the witch hunters claim to be fighting, a confirmation of their darkest fears made flesh. That irony is never labored in the screenplay, but it is present, giving the story a depth that rewards thoughtful viewing. Richard E.Grant, who was simultaneously establishing himself as one of British cinema's most distinctive character actors through his work in films like With Nail and I and How to Get Ahead in Advertising, brings tremendous dignity and physical presence to Giles Redfern, a role that in lesser hands could easily have become a figure of pure comic relief. Grant refuses that easy option entirely. His Redfern is a man of the 17th century navigating the 20th, and while that displacement produces genuine humour, Grant always ensures that the humour emerges from character rather than from caricature. His bewilderment is specific and human, his determination is absolute and moving, and his eventual capacity to function in a world that is utterly alien to him says everything about the depths of his commitment to his mission. Warlock stands today as one of the finest genre films of its era, a movie that deserves far wider recognition than it has historically received, and that rewards every new viewer who discovers it with exactly the kind of intelligent, atmospheric, thoroughly entertaining dark fantasy, filmmaking that the genre at its very best has always been capable of producing. Julian Sands brought something genuinely irreplaceable to the role of the Warlock, a quality of ancient, cold intelligence wrapped in a dangerously beautiful exterior, and his performance alone makes the film essential viewing for anyone who cares about what genre cinema can achieve when gifted actors, skilled filmmakers, and a smart, serious screenplay come together in service of a story worth telling. This is a film that does not announce itself loudly or demand your attention through spectacle alone. It earns your attention through craft, through character, through the sheer magnetic force of its central performances, and through a story that understands something fundamental about the nature of evil, that the most frightening darkness is not the kind that rages and howls, but the kind that moves through the world quietly, purposefully, and with absolute certainty about what it intends to do.